In this video, I want to talk specifically about the gear ratio of your reel, specifically a bait cast reel. One of the most asked questions I get across all my channels are, hey, what is the equipment that you use with that technique? Spinner baits, chatterbaits, whatever it may be. What is the equipment that you use? And along with that, I get asked often, hey, what gear ratio do you recommend? And in this video, I kind of talk about a gear ratio specifically. Also, does gear ratio even matter? That's something that I want to answer in this video. Now, before we get into it, guys, this one is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Right now, if you buy one of my USA-made sun shirts, one of the only USA-made sun shirts on the market, you get a free rod glove. We all have a bunch of rods, and these help protect them, as well as these new neoprene gloves. Man, they are the best for just not getting everything hung in your lure. So all I gotta do is add the sun shirt to cart, add the rod glove to cart. It will automatically discount at checkout. I just got a few new rod glove colors in this kind of gray camo and lime green. So anyways, it is the best way to help support this channel. I will leave a link down below in the description. All right, let's talk about gear ratios. Now, the first thing that I want to kind of come out here and say when it comes to gear ratio is, when in doubt, pick a 7, right? 7 is the number of completion. That's how I always kind of remember it. But a 7.1 to 1, like this reel is, a 7.3 to 1, a 7.4 to 1, anything in that 7 range is a good all-around reel. You can pretty much do anything out there on the market with that reel. So if you are wanting to buy a reel, you don't know what gear ratio to go with the 7, because that way you can take that reel off and use it for a number of different rods or a number of different techniques. Now, real quick, I did want to mention for the beginners out there, you know, if you do not know what gear ratio even means, if it says 7.1 to 1, for example, that means that your spool spins 7.1 times for every one crank of your reel handle. So if it's an 8.1 to 1, it will spin 8 times. So if it's a 10.1 to 1, it's gonna spin, the spool will spin 10 times for every crank. So obviously, the higher you go in gear ratio, the more line that you are bringing in per crank of the reel handle. So I just want to make sure that you guys know that. Now, the big question that I always have asked, or not necessarily asked, is, does this actually even matter? And the truth is, like I said, if you're doubting what you should get, just get something in the 7 range. Now, there are certain techniques out there where having a higher or a lower gear ratio other than that 7 range will help you with that specific technique. Now, there's not a lot of them, there's just a few techniques. So I just want to mention a few of those and why I really like to either step down or step up. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is, if you are fishing a lure that has a lot of drag to it, for example, a deep diving crankbait. A deep diving crankbait has a big bill on it. It has a lot of drag. Anything that has a lot of drag to it, typically a lower gear ratio is going to be a little bit easier on your body. But does that necessarily mean it's best for that particular bait? I'm gonna talk about that in just a minute. But it's much like riding a bike in the grass, right? If you're in the grass, it's hard with a high gear ratio. You click it down and you can go through that grass really easily. Same thing kind of applies when you are fishing a lure that has a lot of drag to it. Stepping down on those lower gear ratios really helps it to be easier on your hand. Now, with that being said, you know, I remember a lot of guys when I was growing up talking about deep cranking. They would refer to gear ratios that were even in the 4s. Like, I remember a guy trying to sell me on a 4.9 to 1 gear ratio reel. And I also remember, you know, a lot of guys still will use something in the 5 range. Now, with all that being said, I typically never go below like a 6. Like, I think a 6.3 to 1 gear ratio reel is probably the lowest gear ratio that I fish with any technique. And especially deep cranking, that's the one that kind of comes to mind. With deep cranking, a lot of times I am ripping a bait. You know, when I deep crank, a lot of times it's in the summer, and a lot of times I am ripping that bait. So I actually like to have a gear ratio that is a little bit faster, because I want that bait coming so fast that bass does not even think about it. They just react to it. Now, could I fish a deep crank with that 7? Yes, I could, but that is where it's really going to be kind of just tiresome on you literally cranking that all day long. You would just not be able to do this at all with anything over a 7, if I'm being 100% honest with you. It'd be too hard, okay? Now, on the flip side of things, let's talk about high gear ratios and what you need to think about when it comes to a high gear ratio. Now, any bait, any lure that you work primarily with your rod, a lot of bottom baits, for example, like a Texas rigged worm, a jig, any rod that you work primarily with your rod and not really with the reel, you can usually step up in your gear ratios. So anytime I'm using, like a jig, I usually am going to use an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio. And the biggest reason that I can kind of get away with that, and the reason that I like that is if I am fishing, say I'm fishing an offshore brush pile, and I got a Texas rigged worm or a jig on, and I'm working that bait across there, and now I want to make another cast, I can actually pick up line, quite a bit faster with that 8.1 to gear ratio reel, get it back to me, make another cast out there, and be back in the water quicker, which is gonna allow me to have more cast throughout the day. Now you may ask, Tyler, well, why not go up into a 9.1 to 1 gear ratio reel or a 10 point something gear ratio reel? Because there are 10s out there. And the biggest thing that I want you guys to think about is when we set the hook on a fish and we're reeling in, especially a big fish, you are primarily cranking that fish in a lot of times. And if you step up a lot in your gear ratio, if you're a 9, a 10, honestly, it's almost like you can't even turn the reel handle at times. I remember I got a specific reel that was a 10.1 to 1 gear ratio reel a number of years ago. I was out there frog fishing. I set the hook on a fish with a frog, and I started to reel that thing in, and I could barely move my reel handle simply because there was so much pressure. It was a bigger fish. It was in a pad field. It was so much pressure for me to just bring that fish in that I couldn't. I literally just had to drag the fish up and crank down, kind of like I was ocean fishing. I couldn't just kind of crank that fish in because of how much pressure was being put. Again, this is kind of that bicycle analogy. Like if I had a 4.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, I could literally just hold my rod and crank that fish in, but I don't want that because, again, I work a frog primarily with my rod tip, so I'm not usually using the reel a whole lot. And with that being said, I like to be able to, hit a target, reel that bait in, hit another target. I think that allows you to get, 100 casts in more a day than the average guy, maybe even more. And 100 more casts is going to lead to a lot more opportunities to catch a bass. So these are all things that I kind of think about when it comes to gear ratio. Again, for me, I typically stick between about 6.3 to 1 and 8.1 to 1. That's kind of the sweet spot. I don't like to go really higher than that, and I don't like to go lower than that. And like I said, something like this, a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, that can help you with a lot of different techniques. The one thing that I do want to mention real quick with the gear ratio is sometimes there are certain times of the year where having a certain gear ratio will get you a few more bites. And I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. This is primarily for cold water. Something that I love to do with cold water spinnerbait fishing is slow roll a bait. And sometimes if I'm using a higher gear ratio reel, like typically I throw a spinnerbait with just that 7.1 to 1 gear ratio. If I am in an area where I know I need to slow that bait down, sometimes it can be just harder for me to physically slow it down. For some of you, this may not be an issue at all, but for me, being a little bit antsy at times, it's just a little bit harder for me to kind of keep that bait down. So what can help me in that situation is stepping down in the gear ratio and going to a reel where I can kind of reel more on my typical pace, but that bait is coming slower back to the boat. So that's a very highly specific technique and a very highly specific example where you can think about gear ratios and how they can actually help you to get more bites. But let me go back to what I said at the beginning. I think if you just are picking out a new reel and you want a good all around 7.1 to 1, 7.2 to 1, 7.3 to 1, that is a great gear ratio. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, give it a thumbs up, comment down below your questions, and maybe you'll like this video. Also, don't forget to check out Finn Fishing, and I will see you guys tomorrow.